gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I find it interesting that earlier today, a congresswoman on the other side of the dais was justifying advertiser boycotts of Twitter or X based upon how unsavory the content is. I logged into X as she was speaking. It turns out she has 2 active accounts. And we have, I think, one of the most ideologically diverse committees in Congress here, and I haven't found anyone who isn't on the platform. I'll yield right now if there's anyone who isn't on the platform and you'd like to identify yourself, but President Biden is on X, AOC is on, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is on X, Gavin Newsom spends a ton of money advertising on X, and you would think that if there was any group that was going to be sensitive to these sort of, risk of being associated with content you disagree with, it would be elected officials, and yet we had essentially 0% of elected officials drop off of X, whereas we had 80% of advertisers pull back from X. So why is this? Well, the committee's report shows why it is. There was a organized, centralized mechanism for causing advertisers to leave the platform. We have an email where one member company to WFA executive says, based on your recommendations, we have stopped all paid advertisement on Twitter. And one of those executives later boasted of causing an 80% below revenue forecast result for Twitter. So, you've been brought in, Mr. Waller, by the minority to talk about how none of this raises any real antitrust concerns. But I think the issue is, and I think it's certainly a legitimate business interest to have brand-related concerns about where your content appears. But when you decide to withdraw from a platform, you have to balance that consideration against the loss of economic opportunity for reaching a particular consumer base. So just to ground it in a real-world example, Mr. Shapiro, how many people do you say access your platforms across all the different platforms you have?
Again, speaking on behalf of just my own YouTube channel, we had about 50 million unique viewers over the last 90 days or so.
Okay, and so let's take the example of a brand. We've heard many brands say ice cream. Presumably some of those 50 million like ice cream?
I would assume so, yes.
And so if you're an ice cream company, maybe you don't want to be associated with Daily Wire for whatever reason. Maybe you've cultivated a particular liberal image. But if you decide not to advertise on this platform, you have to weigh that brand-related consideration against the loss of the opportunity to reach those 50 million people. But maybe that decision becomes easier for you if you know that your competitors are also not going to be advertising to those 50 million people. Mr. Patel, you said that you took your advertisements off of X for a time. Did you consider at that time whether your competitors were going to do the same thing?
No, sir.
You had no consideration of that at all?
No, sir.
Well, it seems to me it's sort of inherent in this global association that now exists that assurance does exist to some degree. So, Mr. Waller, getting back to the antitrust issues, I'm looking at the FTC's own websites here. It says competitor restrictions on the amount or content of advertising that is truthful and not deceptive may be illegal if evidence shows the restrictions have anti-competitive effects and lack reasonable business justifications. They cite an order, actually, in a case involving the Arbiter Association that actually enjoined communications that regulated, restricted, impeded, declared unethical, interfere with, or advised against advertising or publishing. So with that in view, and in view of the fact that we have sort of this coordinating mechanism that exists, that's centralized, that reaches different types of competitors and different types of industries, and we've seen action where they act in concert to stop competing in a given segment, for example, the 50 million people that Mr. Shapiro reaches, and this behavior perhaps redounds to the detriment of consumers looking at the traditional consumer welfare standard and antitrust law. For example, one of his listeners or readers might not learn about the latest ice cream flavor that's available and may go on eating the same old flavors. This is a consumer welfare consideration. So why is this not a legitimate subject for antitrust scrutiny?
That's a lot to unpack, and also I'm just here in my individual capacity, and I don't speak for, nor could I speak for the Federal Trade Commission. Companies are allowed, I'll take Mr. Patel at his word that when he makes an advertising decision, he may or may not take into account what his competitors are doing. But the mere fact that even if he did does not make that an antitrust violation. There's dozens of cases.
But if he was assured that there was an association that they were all part of that is providing consistent advice as to where they should and should not advertise, does that change it?
If he's making a truly independent decision, no, that would not change things from a point of view of antitrust law. Also, I wouldn't expect that Mr. Shapiro's many watchers and listeners would be unaware of ice cream options just because there are or not ads on that platform.
Well, that doesn't really matter. They'd be more aware of them if they're available on the platform that they're using. And so that's the consumer welfare question. And so would you at least agree with me that if you're a company that has brand-related concerns about a particular platform, it's a different calculus whether to continue advertising there if you know your competitors are also not going to continue to advertise there? It's a different calculus at that point, isn't it?
It may be, but the most important thing is whether it's an individual calculus or a concerted agreement.
All right, yield back. Thanks.